Today we're going to take a look at the Volsunga Saga with special attention to the story of Sigurd, the great hero from Norse and Germanic tradition. It's a legend, so you're going to have an element of the story that is definitely taken from history, and we'll talk a little bit about the historical roots as we get into the topic. But this is one of the great sagas from the Norse tradition, and it's kind of depressing that so few people today are familiar with the story, especially in light of the fact that many people are familiar with stories that have been inspired by the story of Sigurd and Norse mythology in general. So as we get into this lecture today, by the end of it, I want to talk a little bit about some of those influences. And let's begin by taking a look at the saga itself. At least, what is a saga? This might be a flashback to something that we covered very, very early in the semester as we defined those terms. But let's get into Old Norse saga and start with the word itself. The word itself actually comes from the Norse, which means that which is said or an account. So when we talk about a saga, we're talking about a story, right, that's being presented to us. Now, we're defining it more specifically for this course as a myth or legend as applied to a major series of events or generations within a family, and acknowledging the fact that it's rooted some way in history, or at least is presented as history. It's one of the things we talked about when we talked about legend and heroic traditions in general, that they're presented in a very realistic way. Some people actually believe they're, fully historical. Other people realize there's, obviously fantasy elements that are woven into a lot of these tales, but at some level, there's some history preserved. Okay, and that's definitely going to be true, as I said, of the Volsunga Saga. So bear with me and we'll get to that. The Volsunga Saga itself, like I said, one of the greatest of the Norse epics, and it's one of the most influential of the Germanic legends that we have. And the saga, as it's eventually put down into writing, is based on an oral tradition, as most Norse mythology is, particularly tied in with those older Eddas, the Poetic Eddas, which we talked about, I think, when we introduced the story of the death of Baldur much earlier. We were actually pulling that story from a work known as the Prose Edda, which I am going to mention very shortly. Okay, so let's move on and take a look at the background for the story of Sigurd. For the setting, we can turn to the period of time at the end of the Roman Empire, or around the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. We're talking AD 400 to 600. This historical period seems to be what's reflected in the legend, and that's based on some of the names that we have and some of the cultural practices and situations that we're looking at in the course of the tale. Now, as far as representations of the story, we don't have an early written version, right? We definitely don't have anything written down in that time frame. So this oral tradition is passed down, and we do have some representations that show up in the visual arts pretty early on. The visual that you see before you is a stone inscription or a stone carving that dates to 11th century in Sweden. It was known as the Rasmund carving, or Ramsund carving, sorry. And this is one of the earliest depictions of elements from the story that we have. It dates to early 11th century, about 1030. And you could see various elements that if you haven't read the story, if you don't know the story, you might not know some of these little visuals. And what you're looking at right now is a drawing based on the inscription. And at the bottom, you can see this one figure right here that is Sigurd. And you can see him with the sword, which he is thrusting upward through this serpentine figure, which represents the dragon Fafnir. Okay, so that's one of the earliest depictions we have of the story. There are others. The Goat Runestone, very much the same. You could see the figure of Sigurd right here. Okay, this one's actually a little bit more clear, the stone itself in the photograph. And then you have the same element come into other stones, like the Dval Runestone. If I'm pronouncing these terms correctly, I definitely don't know the language, so I apologize for my mispronunciations. But right at the top here, you can see again, and I know it's very small, a carving of Sigurd thrusting his sword upward through Fafnir. And if you've read the story, you know that this is exactly how he kills the dragon. It's with this thrust from below, okay, into the underbelly and vulnerable spot of the serpent. The British Isles also have a number of crosses. So the crosses, of course, tied into the Christian tradition. I do want to touch on, near the end of this talk, the connection between Sigurd, Fafnir, and Christian usage of that emblem. So the Kirk Andreas cross on the Isle of Man, the Halton cross at Halton Church, those are some other early representations. Now, when we turn away from visual arts and look at the literary record, our earliest reference to the story comes from a surprising place, maybe not, I guess it depends on the individual, but the Epic of Beowulf, one story that we are going to deal with pretty soon. Okay, it's a few weeks off right now, but the Epic of Beowulf, which dates to around 1000, actually you've probably put it a little earlier, maybe around 900, though there's a debate as to when this was, put down into writing. The story mentions a figure by the name of Sigmund, the Volsung, okay, and he's referred to as a dragon slayer. Now, if you've read the story for today, like I hope you did, Sigmund is in the story, but Sigmund is not a dragon slayer, and this indicates either a mistake on the part of the writer of Beowulf, which is highly doubtful, or more likely, an alternative version of the story. When you're dealing with an oral tradition in mythology, very often you get used to this idea that there are contradictory versions that are out there, and you can't always reconcile these things. So, as we say later on, we're going to take a look at some of the other versions of the story of Sigurd and how it changes in these writings, but you could also understand this possibly another oral tradition that was just preserved happened to come into this Anglo-Saxon epic. Okay, so that's an interesting reference, but it's clearly a reference. The Nibelungenlied, which dates to closer to 1200 AD, is a High Middle German epic. It's a little bit longer. It's actually quite a bit longer than the Volsunga Saga itself. We don't know the author, but this is the next major written version of the story that we have. We'll take a look at some of the elements in this story as well later on. Then you have the Prose Edda put down into writing not long after. So around 1220, this is Snorri Sturluson's compilation of Norse myth based on the earlier Poetic Edda, again put into a prose form. And this is where we pulled earlier that story of the death of Balder when we looked at Loki and the trickster motif. So we'll talk a little bit about this because at this time, we're really dealing with something that is in the process of becoming Christianized. And I want to talk about how Snorri's Christianity kind of influenced this poem in a particular version. But this is, again, the earliest Scandinavian version that we have, and there are very close parallels between some of the little elements that are in the Prose Edda and the much fuller version in the Volsunga Saga itself. Then the Volsunga Saga, okay, a little bit later in the 15th century. Let's just put it somewhere in the middle of the 13th century. You've got this compilation. This is actually a version of the story. Like I said, the most complete and comprehensive version. Also, unknown author. Seems to be based, again, on the oral tradition. The last thing I'm going to put down here is the Poetic Edda, which was composed or put into writing around the same time as the Volsunga Saga, somewhere later in the 13th century. And this is also going to include some fragments of the story. Some of these very much contradictory, so we'll look at some of those as well. But all of these sources give us little pieces, little glimpses of the story or complete versions of the story. Now, let's talk legend. Let's talk historical background. Let's talk the question of the setting and who some of these figures in the story may be derived from or inspired by. Remember, the setting is in the 4th to 6th centuries, and this is a period of heavy migration of Germanic tribes into the Roman Empire. And here's a map where you could see some of the pathways of various tribes. One of the most important tribes kind of furthering the migration process are a tribe known as the Huns, okay, which begin invading Europe, as early as 375 AD, but they're not a Germanic tribe, even though the Volsunga Saga and a lot of these stories characterize the Huns as just one more Germanic tribe. Of course, remember, these stories are much later, and by that time the Huns were just kind of, assumed into this Germanic world. But they themselves, historically, were from the Far East. They were from, Central Asia, basically Mongolian plains. They were nomadic horsemen that swept into Europe and are going to start pushing on some of these other Germanic peoples, driving them into the Roman Empire, sometimes for security, sometimes for protection. But ultimately, all the chaos that emerges in the 4th, 5th, and even 6th centuries is going to end up fragmenting that empire, the western portion of the Roman Empire, and resulting in a number of little kingdoms, Germanic kingdoms, from the Vandal kingdom in North Africa to the Visigothic kingdom in Spain to the short-lived Burgundian kingdom, which happens to be located right here in Central Europe. Okay, now the Burgundians become a really important factor in the story of the Volsungs because some of Sigurd's adventures, actually the end of his whole career, ultimately takes him to the kingdom of the Burgundians, and we're going to look at the Burgundian kings. Now we do know Burgundian kingdom was destroyed by the Huns in the 5th century. All right, so that's why we can easily place the plot of the story around that time. In fact, the saga does preserve some elements of this collapse of the Burgundians. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the historical speculation. Who was Sigurd? Is he based on a historical person? It's hard to say. As far as the kings or characters in the story that we can identify with a pretty high level of certainty. I mean, there's certain figures that we know are definitely based on historical figures. Sigurd's not one of those. Sigurd is up for speculation. There are suggestions as to who Sigurd may be inspired by. Maybe he's not inspired by anybody, right? Maybe he's just purely a mythical, legendary character. But some of the people that have been thrown out as possible inspirations were figures like this one, Sigurd I, who lived or actually reigned 535 to 575. Actually lived during that time. That's way too long for the reign of a king. But he was a Merovingian. If you don't know the Merovingians, they were an early dynasty that ruled over was Gaul at the time, but he's a Frankish king. So this was the beginning of the Frankish kingdom. Of course, Gaul today is known as France. So this is the early dynasty of Frankish kings. It was originally united by Clovis, though it fragmented after his death, and this would have been one of the portions of that empire, that region. It was known as Austrasia, and this is where Sigurd I ruled. Now, he also married a woman, interestingly, by the name of Brunhilda. Okay, now the name Brunhilda, you better know from the story of Sigurd. There was an Avar invasion around this time. The Avars happened to be another group of horsemen from Central Asia, much like the Huns and later Mongols, and he was, engaged in conflict with them at the time. He also had a couple brothers. One of them was a brother named by the name of Gudrun, who ruled the region of Burgundy. And his other brother was Chilperic, who he was at war with. Now, the story of Chilperic has to do with the murder of his wife, Brunhild, the wife of Sigurd. Her sister was married to Chilperic. Chilperic had an affair with another woman named Frigund. She and Chilperic ultimately kill Brunhild's sister, and this leads to a war between the brothers. I don't know if I made that clear or not, but it's really not that important. All you need to know is the brothers are at war with each other. And in the end, even though Sigurd ultimately has the victory over his brother, there's an assassination that takes place where Sigurd is killed at the instigation of Fredegund, the mistress and later wife of Chilperic. Okay, so all we know here is, Sigurd, kind of right time, right place, assassination, name of his wife, all these things kind of add up to possible inspiration for the story. Another possible figure that lies behind the Sigurd narrative would be the more famous figure known as Arminius from early Roman, not early Roman history, but early Roman imperial period. A guy by the name of Arminius was also referred to sometimes affectionately as Hermann the German, who lived between 18 BC and AD 21. So we're talking, early 1st century where he's active. And he's famous as being the son of Sigurd. That's not why he's famous, but he's famous for his assault on the Romans in Germany. He was a leader of a tribe known as the Cherusci, and he was trained and operated within the Roman military. He was a military man who then betrayed Rome. And what he does is he ultimately lures 3 Roman legions into the Teutoburg forest in AD 9. This is during the reign of Augustus. And he ambushes these legions. He has this elaborate plan, and the Roman commander, Publius Quintilius Varus, completely taken by surprise. And if you know the story of Sigurd, you might not get this from the textbook, but where he kills the dragon Fafnir, it takes place at a location known as Nita Heath. Now, it's possible that Varus actually mustered the Roman troops at Nita Heath as he merged and went into the Teutoburg forest. So this is around the place that the legion was ambushed. The legion kind of being stretched out of this long serpentine column as it's making its way through the Teutoburg forest is, hit from the side, ambushed, decimated. This is one of the greatest disasters in Roman military history, and some people think that maybe the Roman legions are represented by the serpent, and Arminius is represented by Sigurd. Later, Arminius himself was assassinated by his own German nobles, so he meets an untimely and tragic end, much like the character of Sigurd as well. So these are just speculations that have been thrown out by scholars over the past couple centuries. Take it for what you want. I'm not going to make any definite claim as to him being a historical figure at all, but I just want to throw out some of these things. Now, what about some of the other characters? We already talked a little bit about Brunhild of Austrasia. This is the wife of Sigurd, and she seems to be behind maybe the character of Brunhild. Obviously, the name is exactly the same, so that wouldn't be a surprise. She was a Visigothic princess from Spain who ended up marrying Sigurd, the first Merovingian king. And after his death, remember, he was assassinated, she is regent for their son, grandson, and her great-grandson. So for a number of the succeeding Merovingian kings, she kind of governed while they were young. Ultimately, she needed to seek protection from Sigurd's brother Guntram in this conflict with his other brother Chilperic. Now, Chilperic's son Clothair ultimately defeats her and ends up having her executed. Literally, she's torn apart by horses. This is a little visual kind of showing the demise of Brunhilda of Austrasia. So kind of like Brunhilda in the story, kind of a powerful figure who, again, meets an untimely and tragic death. Not by suicide as the Brunhilde in the story, but according to this horrible mutilation by horses. Gunnar, another character that seems to really be based on history. Now, Guntram of Burgundy, who we just mentioned, the brother of Sigurd, is a potential, but more likely he's based on the figure of Gundaharius, the king of Burgundy who died around 437, a little bit earlier, back in the 5th century. Now, Gundaharius is the first documented king of the Burgundians, and he ruled right across from Roman Gaul and actually made some incursions into Roman territory, which resulted in a Roman response by the Roman general, one of the last great Roman generals, Flavius Aetius, who had some Hun allies. So in this conflict, ultimately, the kingdom of Burgundy is destroyed. Okay, so when you get to this idea of Gunnar in the story being killed by the Huns, and kind of a collapse of his family, this reflects this period where the kingdom of Burgundy was destroyed by the Huns and the Romans. And the name, again, fits, the time period fits. This is really a good, likely inspiration for the figure of Gunnar. But that's not all. We have the most obvious or most definite identifications of characters in the story with the figures of Atli and Svanhild. Atli is, in the story, the brother of Brunhild. And he is clearly based on Attila the Hun, who is really the most famous of all these historical personages that I've thrown at you. 406 to 453, he was the leader, the most aggressive leader of the Huns, and built a really large kingdom that took over a good chunk of Europe. Now, according to Marcellinus Comes, a 5th century historian, he says that Attila was actually killed by his young wife Ildiko. Now, we do know by another historian, Priscus, who says that Attila died of a nosebleed at a wedding feast. It's possible that these two incidences do overlap, that he may have been poisoned. We really don't know the cause of his death, but the idea that he was killed by his wife kind of lines up with what we see happen to Atli in the story, where he is ultimately killed by his wife Gudrun. All right? So that's an easy one to identify. And then the last one, Svanhild, seems to be based on the woman known as Sunilda. Now, Sunilda was married to a Gothic king by the name of Ermaneric. In the mythology, in the story of Sigurd, she's actually the daughter of Sigurd and Sigurd and Gudrun. Okay, so at the end of the story of the Volsungs, we're going to see what happens to Svanhild, but it seems to be an exact reproduction of what the historians say happened to Sunilda. This was the younger wife. He was a much older man, according to Jordanes, and he has her torn apart by horses. And then later her brothers, Ammius and Saurus, who are represented in the Volsunga Saga as Hamdir and Sorli, exact revenge. But they fail to kill King Ermaneric. Rather, they disfigure him by cutting off his hands, and before he dies, he is able to have the two brothers killed. Okay, so that's also in the story. So all of these little pieces really clearly indicate, I think, that you're dealing with a good bit of history woven into a wonderful, wonderful story. Now, let's get into the story. Let's break it down. Let's look at the basic characters. We're going to start with the major characters. I'm just going to introduce them, and then I'm going to give them back to you later as we go through the plot. And I want to kind of lay them out because it gets a little bit confusing. There are a lot of names that are very similar. A lot of names that begin with S, a lot of names that begin with G. Those are the two, big groups that confuse most readers. Sigurd, Sigmund, Signy, Sigir, etc. Gudrun, Gunnar, Grimhild, etc. Okay, so let me just lay some of these out so it will, save us some of that frustration. Among the gods, you've got Odin, the most important god, obviously in Norse mythology, and he's going to have a major role to play in the story of the Volsunga Saga. He's the Allfather. He makes numerous appearances, but they don't always tell you who he is. They'll give you the description. So remember the man with one eye, the man who wears the blue cloak and the wide-brimmed hat, the long beard. That description, the audience knows who that is when you hear that description, and that's what the author often does. Loki has a role to play, and it's kind of neat to see Loki in a role where he's not a complete bad guy. He's still a trickster, he's still a troublemaker, but he's not a villain in this story, so that's refreshing. Then we've got the human characters. Sigmund, who's a descendant, as all the Volsungs are, of Odin. He's the son of a guy by the name of Volsung, he's the father of Sigurd, and he's the king of Hunland in the story. Then you have the son Sigurd, who is really our main character. He's the dragon slayer. He's the one who we're going to follow most of the time. Regin is one of his mentors. He was a blacksmith who helped raise Sigurd Sigurd. I put that down incorrectly on the visual. I put Sigmund. I meant to put Sigurd. Sorry about that. I wasn't paying attention, I guess, when I was typing. But he is the mentor to Sigurd and is going to be the one who instigates the initial adventure. He's going to be the one that puts forth the call to adventure for Sigurd. Raedmar is the father of Regin. He's also the father of the brothers Fafnir and Otter, who we're going to get into very shortly. Fafnir, the most important of the brothers, he's the dragon. Okay, he's not fully a dragon. He's a character who takes the form of a dragon. A lot of characters in this story are going to have the power to shapeshift. Really important magical power. A lot of magic in Norse mythology and in this story in particular. And he also guards the gold treasure that's known as Andvari's hoard. All right? Andvari is the dwarf who owns this gold initially, and he also owns a special gold ring that's going to be really important to the story. And then you've got the character Brunhild, who is a Valkyrie. She is a sleeping Valkyrie who is eventually going to fall in love with Sigurd. Grimhild, who is the queen of the Burgundians and the mother of the hero Gunnar and his sister Gudrun. She is also a witch, so she's got magical powers. Then you've got Gudrun herself, who becomes the wife of Sigurd. You've got Gunnar, who becomes the husband of Brunhild. And then you've got Guttorm, who is the youngest of the Gjúkingar. Gjúkingar, that's the family of Gjúki. Gjúki's the king, Grimhild's the mother and queen. And he's going to be the one who kills our hero at the tragic end. Okay, or actually before the final tragic end, because there's more of the story after Sigurd departs. So let's take a look at how we begin. We begin with the lineage of Odin. Okay, Odin, who is the Allfather, has many children. One of these children is a guy by the name of Siggi. Now, Siggi is a king of the Huns, and Siggi ends up killing a thrall, and he ends up being exiled. Now, down the road, we get to Reyrir. Reyrir is his son. Now, Reyrir, as we saw when we talked about the family romance last time, a lot of times you have difficulty conceiving a child, and in the story, Reyrir has difficulty conceiving a child with his wife, and it takes the instigation of the god Odin to help this along by presenting him with a magic apple. Okay, this Odin gives a magic apple that produces for him a son. The son is going to be Volsung. Now, Volsung is, when I say a saga usually covers numerous generations, that's exactly what you have in the beginning of the Volsunga Saga. You've got short stories of numerous generations within the family as we approach Sigurd. Now, we're going to start getting longer and longer stories as we near Sigurd, so we have a little bit more on Volsung, and then we're going to have a lot more on his son Sigmund before we get to Sigurd. So Volsung, we could say a little bit more about. He was born after being conceived 6 years in the womb. All right, this is kind of a lengthy birth, so talk about a difficult conception and unique birth scenario. There's Volsung. But he's known as being fearless. This is a man that will never shy away from danger. And it's one of the things that he prides himself on, and it will get him and his children into trouble in the story. He marries a giantess, Hlod, who, again, shows you what kind of powerful man he is, and he has 11 children with her, including the twins Sigmund and Signy, who are now going to follow forward, because the adventure now turns towards Sigmund. Okay, so let's talk about the adventures of Sigmund. There's a lot of fun stories with Sigmund. Can't really talk about them all, but I am going to slow down and give you some stuff that wasn't in your textbook. So, first of all, reminder, he's not a dragon slayer, in spite of what the author of Beowulf tells us, according to this tale. And where we're going to pick up the story of Sigmund is with the wedding of his sister Signy to King Sigurd. Now, this is not a fortunate marriage. Sigurd is not a good guy, but at the wedding, you do have a very important visitor show up. A man in a blue cloak and a broad-brimmed hat with a long beard, and he's missing an eye, so you know who it is. It's Odin. And he brings a gift. He brings a sword, a magnificent sword, which he drives up to the hilt into a tree around which this wedding is situated, the tree known as Barnstock. Now, the idea is whoever is worthy will be able to draw the sword, right? Whoever's worthy can pick up the hammer of Thor. Whoever's worthy can draw the sword from the stone. And if you're familiar with the King Arthur tradition, this is, again, an earlier version of that, the sword from the tree. But when you draw it, you don't become king of all England or anything like that. You don't turn into the god of thunder. You simply get to keep the sword, which is still a pretty good gift. I mean, this is a fantastic blade. Now, Sigmund is the only one who's able to do this. Sigurd, the guy who's being married, is going to want this sword really badly, and after the wedding is over, he is going to attempt to lure the whole Volsung clan to his home. This is after, he goes away with his bride Signy, and this is a trap that he's going to set. You're going to see routinely in the story the idea of somebody luring somebody else into a trap. And this is, again, to obtain very often a treasure. Here it's the sword. So the trap is set. Volsung, who's been warned about this, I believe by Signy, if I'm remembering the story correctly, doesn't want to shy away. He realizes it might be a trap, but he's going to go anyways to this invitation of King Sigurd. And of course, he and his sons fall into the trap, and Volsung is actually killed. So his overconfidence kind of does him in. Now, the boys, the entire family, right, the sons, are chained. They're put into stocks in the woods. There's a log, and they're all, bound head and arms through the wood of the log. All of them in a row, with Sigmund being the last one in line. Now, every day, while they're imprisoned there by Sigurd's mother, who happens to be a werewolf, she changes form into the wolf, and day by day she comes out and she devours one of the brothers, starting at one end of the log and each day working its way down the log, devouring a separate brother, until only Sigmund remains. Now, Signy is very loyal to her brothers. She is definitely loyal to her twin brother Sigmund, and she would like to save him, if at all possible. And then she wants to have revenge on her evil husband. Now, what she does to save Sigmund is she goes out one day with a thing of honey, and she basically bastes his face and body in the sweet honey, has him open his mouth, and she puts a big gob of honey inside Sigmund's mouth. Now, the day when the wolf arrives to devour him, the wolf immediately begins to lick the honey. And of course, it's really tasty, and the wolf is, licking his face, and Sigmund at the right moment opens his mouth and offers the wolf the honey that's inside. And as the wolf sticks her tongue into Sigmund's mouth, he bites down with all that he can, muster all the strength that he has. And as the wolf starts to panic and try to pull back and puts its paws up on the log to pull backward, eventually it bursts Sigmund free of the trap, and then he's able to kill the wolf. Okay? So here you've got maybe not a dragon slayer, but definitely a werewolf slayer. But he's free. And the next stage is to get vengeance, to avenge the death of his father and his brothers, and Signy is going to help him do this. She is going to send her children, because she's had children in the meantime. This takes course over a number of years. This is a long, drawn-out revenge. But Signy has given birth to a number of children. Now, because they're the sons of Sigurd, they're not the bravest of guys. I mean, it's always the idea is, Volsung is incredibly courageous, but, other people not so much. She's going to use her own children to try to get vengeance on their father. And she sends the boys one at a time out to visit Uncle Sigmund. They don't really know that it's their uncle, but Sigmund's been living in the woods nearby in a little hut, biding his time. Now, these boys are already revealed as being a little bit weak, like I said, and she's tested them herself by strangely sewing their clothing right into their flesh. At least the first boy she does this with, and he winces in pain, as most people would if they have a needle, being sewn into their skin over and over again. But the idea is, this is not what a Volsung would do. This is, the mark of a coward or a lesser man. But the boys stand out nonetheless to have a test by Sigmund, and Sigmund has him in the hut, and he leaves a bag of flour on the counter with a poisonous serpent or snake inside, and it's tied up and it's left there, and he says, I'm going to go out hunting. I'm going to come back with some food. While I'm away, you need to make bread. Make bread so that we can eat when I return. And then he leaves. Now the boy sees the bag, which is moving around the counter, and he knows something dangerous is inside, and he doesn't want to touch it. So when Sigmund eventually returns, he says, where's the bread? And the boy says, well, I didn't make the bread. There was something in the bag. I didn't want to open it. And Sigmund realizes this child is, useless to me. And Signy basically tells him, do away with the child, and he's killed. Okay, so Sigmund kills the first son. Now, a while later, the second son is sent out, and you have the same scenario again with the bag of flour left. The child fails to do it. Sigmund kills the other son. And after a while, Signy's running out of children. So she decides if you're going to have a child who's going to help her in this plot of revenge, you need to have a child who's brave enough. And the only way to have a child brave enough would be to have a Volsung baby. Right? Not just half Volsung, but a full Volsung baby. So here's our first instance of shape-shifting in the Volsung family. Signy exchanges appearances with another woman, then goes out to the hut and sleeps with her own brother. Unbeknownst to Sigmund, he doesn't know that it's his sister, but he sleeps with her and she conceives a child. This child is later born, and he's going to be named Sinfjotli. Sinfjotli, when he's older, is sent out again to Sigmund, and he is given the same test. But this time, when Sigmund returns from hunting, there's bread on the table. And Sigmund says, wasn't there something unusual about the bag of flour? And Sinfjotli says, yeah, it was moving around, but I just beat the heck out of it with my hands and kneaded the thing into the dough. So Sigmund says, okay, well, it was a poisonous serpent, so that bread is really kind of contaminated with poison. Don't eat it. Let me eat it. Ultimately, we find out, of course, that Sigmund has an immunity to poison. Sinfjotli doesn't. But the two of them then develop kind of a bond, father-son bond. They go out and they have all kinds of adventures in the meantime before they ever exact revenge on Sigurd, but eventually they do this. They actually spend a time themselves as kind of werewolves in the wilderness, but ultimately they do get vengeance with Signy on Sigurd. And then later, Sinfjotli will succumb to poison in an interesting scenario that I probably don't need to go through. Okay, I just realized he's vulnerable, and he's going to die long before his younger brother Sigurd will be born. So Sinfjotli is probably the first real interesting heroic character that is a son of Sigmund, but he's not the last. Now, one day, Sigmund is out fighting a battle, and we have the appearance one more time of a one-eyed man on the battlefield who comes up against Sigmund, and we know again who this is. Unfortunately, in this instance, he doesn't bring a gift, but he shatters the gift he originally brought. The sword of Sigmund is broken into pieces against Odin's spear, and those pieces are then going to be passed on to Sigmund's wife, Hjordis, and she's going to then pass them on to her yet-to-be-born son, who's going to be named Sigurd. And Sigmund dies a tragic death that day. Now, later, Sigurd is going to be born. Hjordis will marry another king, a guy by the name of Alf. And then, like many hero stories, you've got this idea of this child being born in a unique situation, separated from his true father, the loss of identity. That whole scenario manifests once more in mythology. Part of his raising is at the hands of the blacksmith known as Regin. So as young Sigurd grows up and he's of the age when he should start to build for himself his own reputation, Regin is going to present him with the heroic challenge, okay, the call to adventure. And this is where we're going to have a flashback and learn a little bit about Regin's past. He's going to call Sigurd to go and deal with the dragon Fafnir. He says, I've got a mission for you. I want to send you out to kill this dragon, and we can obtain this gold hoard that the dragon guards. And Sigurd, who smartly wants a little bit more information before he agrees to do such a thing. I mean, dragons are dangerous. Says, why don't you tell me a little bit more about the dragon? And this is where we get to that flashback. So Regin is going to tell the story about his family. Now, his father's name is Reidmar. He has a brother named Fafnir, and he has a brother named Otter. There's 3 sons. Fafnir is a lot like his dad, kind of ambitious, cruel, powerful. The other brother, Otter, is the exact opposite. He is a guy who loves enjoying nature. He loves to go fishing. He loves to relax and has the magical ability of turning himself into an otter. That's where this name comes from. And that's what he does. He basically swims around as an otter, does some fishing, suns himself. Now, one day, while Otter is out doing his favorite activity, along come some gods who happen to be traveling the earth: Odin, Hoenir, and Loki. And they come upon Otter, and the gods are hungry. It's time for dinner, and Loki decides he's going to obtain some fish very easily, and he shows off by throwing a rock across the water, and he strikes the otter, killing it, and is able to take all of the fish that the otter had caught, plus the otter himself, into a little bag. So, with one shot, he has obtained an entire meal, and then off they go on their way. They eventually get to the home of Hreidmar. Now, it's nighttime, and they're going to need some shelter for the night, so they ask hospitality from Hreidmar, and Hreidmar welcomes them in and offers them hospitality, and would provide food, except for the fact that the gods brought their own. Now, when the fish pop out of the bag, along with the fish plummets the body of Otter, and immediately Hreidmar recognizes the corpse as the corpse of his own son. And he's upset, but what can you do? Well, the tradition that the Germanic tribes had, a way of avoiding some kind of blood feud and vengeance for the loss of a life, he demands a payment. He demands weregild. Okay, a payment that's, basically set up by a family member for the loss of another family member that should be equivalent to the value of the life lost. So he says, I'm going to hold you hostage. He's going to hold Hoenir and Odin as his prisoners, and Loki is going to go out to obtain the payment. What he wants is enough gold to stuff the otter skin and cover Otter altogether so that you can't see any of the fur and the otter, which seems a little bit gross, knowing that this happens to be his son. He's going to have his own son stuffed with gold. But anyways, Loki is going to go off, and he's going to obtain this treasure. Now, this treasure is possessed by a character known as Andvari, who's a dwarf. Now, Andvari is also a shapeshifter, and Andvari takes the shape of a pike, of a fish, and he's in the water when Loki comes upon him, and Loki catches him. And Loki basically demands that he turn over his gold hoard. And Andvari is happy to do this, to buy his freedom. He says, take the gold, take whatever you want, just leave me one piece is all I ask, and that's this one little gold ring that's going to be known as Andvaranot. Well, Loki says, no, I think I'll take everything, including the ring. What are you going to do to stop me, ultimately? And Andvari, at that point, in his anger, curses the gold and the ring. Okay? Now, this one ring is going to cause all kinds of problem in the rest of the story. The curse we need to pay attention to, and you need to try to follow the movement of the ring throughout the rest of the story, because everybody that touches this ring, everybody that possesses this ring is going to meet some kind of tragic end before their time. So just try to keep track of that as we work through the rest of the tale. Now, the reason Andvari wanted to keep the ring for himself is not because it was, I guess it was particularly valuable, but basically because it has a magical power. Now, the power is to create more gold. And you would imagine you'd have no problem giving up an entire gold treasure if you've got a magic ring that just make you another gold treasure. But again, Loki would like this, and he actually wants to keep it for himself. So when they get back, he presents the gold to Hreidmar. He covers the body, he stuffs the body, but there's this one little whisker that keeps popping out. And in the end, Loki has to depart with the ring because that's the last piece that he has, and that's going to cover the one whisker and satisfy Hreidmar's demand. Whereupon Hreidmar releases Odin and the gods, and they go on their way. Now, Hreidmar is going to be jealously guarding his treasure, and he doesn't want to share it with his sons Regin and Fafnir, who would like their portion. Hreidmar says, no, it's my son, it's my gold. He goes to bed one night, and the older brother Fafnir comes up with the plan to steal the gold and murder his father. So while Hreidmar is sleeping, Fafnir comes in, stabs him to death, and then takes the gold for himself. But Fafnir, being a lot like his dad, doesn't want to share any with his brother Regin, so to protect it, Fafnir changes form, assumes the shape and power and strength of a dragon, and has been guarding the gold ever since. So that's the story Regin presents to Sigurd. Now, Sigurd's like, dragons are dangerous. This sounds a little bit difficult. I don't think I'm up for the task. And then Regin reminds him indirectly of his father's reputation, using kind of reverse psychology. He basically says, well, maybe you're not up to the standard of a Volsung, right? Maybe you're not as brave as a true Volsung would be. And that's exactly the right words that he needed to hear, because Sigurd is now inspired to live up to his name, right? There's a pressure to live up to the image of your father and your ancestors and those types of things. So he says, okay, I'll take this challenge. Now, we're dealing with an impossible task. And to go about doing this, you need the right equipment. Regin would simply like Sigurd away. He wants to obtain the gold, but in the process, if he could send him to do a very dangerous task, he can eliminate the character of Sigurd and possess all the gold for himself. So Regin's not a good guy. He might be the mentor of Sigurd, but he's the type of mentor that turns into the villain. Now, before Sigurd is willing to go on the task, he needs some implements. He needs a sword. He needs a horse, and he gets these. His horse, Grani, is given to him by Odin, who shows up one more time in the story. And Grani is the most brave steed, descendant of Odin's own horse, Sleipnir. So that's going to be good. But what about a sword? Regin fails to make him a sword worthy of a great hero. And every sword that Regin makes him breaks when he tests it on the anvil. So he needs something better. And what they end up doing is obtaining the pieces of the original sword that his father had. Those pieces that have been passed down and are then reforged to form a new sword by the name of Gram. Now, Gram is going to be the strongest, sharpest sword that has ever been, okay? And it cuts through the anvil. It actually cuts through a piece of wool as it floats down the stream, just to indicate exactly how good this blade is. But now, with this equipment, he's sent off to kill Fafnir. Like I said, it's an impossible task, which means not that it's literally impossible, but that it was meant in some way to be failed. Not that he's not going to kill the dragon and he's not going to obtain the gold. The idea is that he'll die in the process. The dragon will be gone, the gold will be obtained, and Sigurd himself will be gone as well. So here's Sigurd implementing the plan where he's digging a pit. It's on the pathway where Fafnir proceeds every day to get a drink of water. At the end of the path, there's a little cliff, and he kind of bends his head over the cliff to drink from the water below. But it's sure thing that he's going to come down this path because, like I said, it's a daily activity. Sigurd is digging this pit, and his plan is to lay inside the pit and cover himself over so the dragon can't see him as the dragon comes across the path. And then while the Fafnir is above the pit, Sigurd will stab upward from the safety of the pit and kill the dragon. Now, who should show up in the midst of digging the pit? Some one-eyed stranger who reveals to Sigurd that you're being a fool. You know, you're following this plan without even the awareness that you're going to die in the process. Because what's going to happen is you're going to stab the dragon, the blood is going to pour into the pool, and you're going to drown there, trapped beneath the dragon's body. So Odin advises him to modify the plan, and what he does is he digs a number of little pits off of the main pit to drain the water, rather to drain the blood. Follows through with the plan. He kills Fafnir. He lives through the process. Now, your textbook says once the blood hits his skin, he turns invulnerable, with the exception of one little spot on his back, which was covered by a leaf. Okay? Now, that particular story of the invulnerable Sigurd is not part of the Volsunga Saga. That's actually part of a different tradition that I'm going to get to later. But that's what your book tells us. Anyways, we do know he obtains the gold, he obtains the ring, he obtains the heart of the dragon as well. And he brings it back to Regin, who would like the dragon heart for himself, because the dragon heart has the ability to give you a gift of knowledge. If you eat the dragon heart, you're going to gain knowledge, mystical knowledge. Now, while they're sitting around the fire after their victory, Sigurd is roasting the heart on a spit for Regin, and the blood from the heart is kind of bubbling out of the wound and is trickling down the stick that it's attached to, and it eventually hits Sigurd's finger, and he puts his finger into his mouth, as we often do when we burn ourselves. We'll kind of, put it into our mouth, and he tastes the blood of the dragon. As soon as he does, he gains knowledge, he gains insight, and what he can do is understand the speech of birds. Now, it just so happens that there are a number of birds right there above him in the tree that are talking amongst themselves about what's going to happen to Sigurd if he doesn't wisen up. They tell him a little bit about the fact that Regin is out to get him, that he needs to, if he's wise, kill Regin, take the treasure for himself, and be on his way, which he immediately does. So he gets up, kills Regin, and then takes the treasure for himself. And then he also learns a little bit about this Valkyrie by the name of Brunhild at the time. I believe that's when he first hears about her. Okay, that's kind of the end of part one for the story of Sigurd. He's made a name for himself. He's done his first major combat with a very ferocious dragon, the Alpha Predator, and then he goes on, and we encounter finally the character of Brunhild. She is the sleeping Valkyrie, and now, remember, follow the ring. When Sigurd first comes upon Brunhild, she is asleep, and we're not even told directly that she's a Valkyrie just yet. That actually does come into the story, but so far all we know is there's this warrior princess who is in this castle surrounded by this ring of fire. Now, the backstory for Brunhild is that she's been punished by Odin because she's disobeyed. As a Valkyrie, the task of a Valkyrie is to obey Odin, to go into the battlefield and withdraw the noble and valiant warriors who die and bring them up to Valhalla in preparation for Ragnarok. I think we talked a little bit about that earlier in the semester. Now, in this particular episode, she was told to go down and bring the soul of this young warrior up to Valhalla. But when she goes down to the battlefield, she sees this as young warriors in combat with this much older king. And she realizes the young warrior still has a long life ahead of him. She should take the old man because he's lived his life. And she takes, in disobedience, the wrong man to Valhalla. And Odin thereby punishes her by putting her into a deep sleep and also forcing her in the future to have to marry a mortal human being. Now, she has a stipulation that she will not marry anybody but the bravest of warriors. Okay, she's going to hold out for somebody that is incredibly valiant. Now, that happens to be Sigurd, and he's going to prove this by walking through the ring of fire. That's kind of a test. Only a brave warrior will be able to cross through a ring of fire, which he does. So we have this first encounter between Brunhild, Sigurd. He wakes her from her sleep by cutting through her armor, releasing her from the sleep. In some accounts, he removes a thorn that's in her flesh that has put her into the slumber. But nonetheless, they meet. They kind of fall in love. But the Volsunga Saga is a little bit confusing because very soon Sigurd departs and then encounters her a second time. I don't think your textbook tells you that, but there's a second meeting with her at Hymir's hall. Hymir, I believe, is her uncle in the story, if I'm recalling correctly. And at this time, when they meet again, they exchange a promise that they're going to marry each other. All right, Sigurd says, I will come back for you and I will marry you. And Brunhild, who has the power of prophecy, basically tells him, you're not going to do that. You're going to make this promise to me, but what's going to happen actually is you're going to depart, you're going to forget all about me, you're going to marry another woman, and she's very specific as to who it is and what's going to happen. She says, you're going to forget me and marry another, and of course he says, how could I possibly forget you? And then he swears that he's going to return, and he gives her the ring. Okay, this is literally the engagement ring from hell, a ring that you do not want to possess, as you already know. But he leaves that, importantly, with Brunhild. Again, follow the ring. Now, off he goes. They don't really explain why he departs, but apparently he leaves her pregnant. We're going to find out later that he does have a child with Brunhild, and it seems to be something that must take place in one of these first two meetings, though we don't get much information about that. It might be the most complete version of the story that we have in the Norse tradition, but it still has holes in it and some contradictory elements in it. So just keep that in mind. Most likely he did sleep with her on one of these meetings. Where he ends up going is to the kingdom of the Burgundians, to King Giuki, and meets the family known as the Giukingar, right? The family of Gudrun, Gunnar, and their mother Grimhild. Now, Giuki's the king, Grimhild's the queen, and what we know about Grimhild already is that she's a witch, she's a sorceress. She dabbles in magic, and she's pretty skilled, but Sigurd is welcomed in kind of as one of the family. He spends a long time with the Giukingar and really comes to love them, and they come to love him. As a matter of fact, Grimhild adores Sigurd and would like for him to marry her daughter Gudrun. Now, the problem is Brunhild. So what Grimhild does is she uses a magic potion to cause Sigurd to forget. Right? It's not a love potion, it's a forgetfulness potion. Sigurd drinks the potion, forgets all about Brunhild, which I think is a neat thing because when we find out then that he falls in love with Gudrun and ultimately marries Gudrun, you got to realize this is not just due to the magic. He actually does love this woman, and that's, I think, an important aspect of their relationship and his character. But Grimhild has a secondary plan because she wants her son Gunnar to have a proper bride as well, and she would like him to marry this princess Brunhild. But to obtain Brunhild, once again, you have to pass the trial by fire. And Gunnar is more than willing to do this. As a matter of fact, they approach the Ring of Fire. He's there with Sigurd, and he's on his horse, and he's about to ride through the flames, but his horse won't go any further. His horse is, a cowardly horse in comparison to Gunnar himself, and in comparison to Sigurd's horse. So Gunnar basically says, why don't you give me your horse? Give me Grani, I'll ride through and, claim Brunhild for my own. And unfortunately, Grani's not going to move for anybody but Sigurd himself. So the third plan is to just use magic and change their appearances. And this is where you have another shape-shifting scene. Gunnar takes on the guise of Sigurd. Sigurd takes on the guise of Gunnar. And it's Sigurd who rides through once again. The second time he's ridden through the Ring of Fire. This time he looks like Gunnar. And when he goes inside, he is going to win the hand of Brunhild for Gunnar, because she thinks it is Gunnar. And he, if he crosses the Ring of Fire, that proves he's valiant and brave enough to be worthy of her love and marriage. So they do this. Now, he stays in the castle with Brunhild for a number of days. Like 3 nights he stays in there and sleeps with her. And the story is that he puts the sword Gram between them so that, he never actually touches her. By the end of this, that ring, which he had left with her, is given to Sigurd once more. Of course, she thinks she's giving it to Gunnar. And again, follow the ring. So the wedding finally takes place. During the time of the wedding, actually prior to the wedding, I should mention that she drops her daughter Aslog, who off with her uncle Heimir. Now, the story of Aslog and Heimir is going to show up in another Norse saga. We'll talk about that one a little bit later. But you do have that idea of the daughter being present by this point in the story, though you're not going to see her really again for the entire rest of the saga. Anyways, you get to the wedding of Gunnar, and at the wedding, once it's complete, the magic wears off, and Sigurd realizes that he forgot all about Brunhild. He recognizes her really for the first time. But the question is, what does he do? Does he follow his heart? Does he go back to, the woman he has vowed to marry, the woman that he truly loves the most? No, he decides not to. He's going to be loyal to his new wife, Gudrun, who he does really love, like authentically. And he realizes to do that would tear apart the family, right? Tear apart this relationship. I mean, the whole idea of the Gukingars in him and their relationship is that he really is one of them. He becomes, a blood brother to Gunnar. And he doesn't want to stab Gunnar in the back. He doesn't want to betray Gudrun. He doesn't want to do anything that's going to harm that really important relationship. So he's going to keep his mouth shut. Whatever's happened has happened. Let's leave things as they are. Now, everything is going to come into light during a particular bathing session with the women, Gudrun and Brunhild, as they go to the river to bathe. Now, this is one of the most important scenes in the story. As they're bathing, what they start to do is they jockey for position. They each want to be upstream of the other, which makes you wonder how often these women bathe, because, obviously if you're downstream, how dirty are you going to actually get from the other person? But most likely they were dyeing their hair, and some of the dyes that they used might have been really fairly, type of stuff that you don't want to get all over you. But either way, the debate that they are engaged in is who deserves to be upriver of the other, and that's completely based on who has the better husband. Right? That's the standard of value here. Whose husband is the better husband? And what they mean by better husband is not, who is more affectionate, who brings flowers, who, helps raise the children better. Any of those things that we might think of as husbandly roles, that has nothing to do with it. For the culture, what makes a man a good husband is, are they a good warrior? Are they brave? Are they noble? Are they heroic? And that's what the whole argument is based around, who's the braver husband? And Brunhild says, well, Gunnar is clearly the braver husband because he came through the Ring of Fire to win my hand. Apparently not remembering the fact that Sigurd did the very same thing. So it's not a very strong argument if you're going to distinguish one over the other. But then Gudrun comes back and says, oh, you think that was Gunnar that rode through the Ring of Fire? It was actually Sigurd, who just happened to look like Gunnar. And I have proof. And then what does she produce but the ring? Which is now in her possession, unfortunately for Gudrun. But it obviously convinces Brunhild. And in her disappointment, in this revelation, she plots her revenge. She's been duped. She's obviously married the lesser man. She's broken her vow to marry only the noblest of characters, and here she is humiliated and stuck in a marriage with Gunnar, who now she's going to resent. But the plot is going to hatch, and this is going to lead ultimately to the demise of Sigurd. And it's through this little love triangle, right? Gunnar, Sigurd, Brunhild. When all of this comes out, there is an engagement between, engagement in the sense of a discussion between Brunhild and Sigurd. And Sigurd is feeling really bad about this whole situation, actually considers for a moment leaving Gudrun and going to Brunhild. But in the end, he decides not to do this. Rather, Brunhild ends up going to Gunnar to try to get vengeance. And this is where we get a little bit of a critique of the virtue of love, whether it's actually a virtue at all. Remember, we talked about romantic heroes as a kind of late development in legend and mythology. Most heroes, including Rama, who goes to rescue his wife Sita, and other characters earlier, may do certain things for the hand of a woman, but it's not necessarily the ultimate value, love. Love is often critiqued in mythology as something that leads to foolishness, actually blindness. So what Brunhild actually does here illustrates that fact, because in her anger, she's going to manipulate her husband Gunnar. And she's going to tell Gunnar that Sigurd, when he was in the castle, winning her hand for Gunnar, actually slept with Brunhild, violating that trust between Sigurd and Gunnar. Now, Gunnar should know Sigurd. He should know his character. I mean, these guys are incredibly close. Yet, the failure is due to the fact that Gunnar is blinded by his affection for Brunhild, and he falls for the lie. All right, he's deceived, and he is going to exact revenge for his wife. Of course, he's not brave enough to do it himself. He decides he's going to get his younger brother. All right, you've got Gunnar, you've got the brother Hogni, who we really haven't mentioned. I'll mention him a little bit later. But they're going to turn to the youngest brother, their brother Guttorm. Neither one of them want to do it, so let's get Mikey. That's a reference to an old commercial that might be way before your time, but back in the day, there was a Life, I don't know if you guys remember Life cereal. It had a very famous campaign where you get the two brothers that are about to eat a cereal that is supposedly healthy, and they don't want to taste it, so they decide to get their youngest brother, Mikey, to try it. And of course, he liked it, and same thing happens here. Guttorm, young enough to decide to do what he's being asked of his older brothers. Now, what happens in your text is a little bit different than what happens in the Volsunga Saga itself. Your text says they go off on a hunt, and before the hunt, Guttorm goes to meet with Gudrun, who asks Guttorm to watch her husband's back, literally. He says, Sigurd, by the way, has a weak spot on his back. It's the only place he could be killed if he should be hit there. Just make sure he's not struck there at any moment during the hunt. And to make sure that Guttorm is able to protect him, she takes a jacket and she sews into the back of the jacket a pattern of a leaf, literally sending her husband hunting with a bullseye target right there for his would-be assassin. And in the story in your textbook, of course, Sigurd ends up washing in the stream, and while he's bent over the water, up comes Guttorm, who stabs him through the weak spot, killing him. Now, the Volsunga Saga doesn't go there. In the Volsunga Saga, Sigurd, number one, isn't invulnerable, and is merely sleeping in his bed when Guttorm comes into the bedchamber and stabs Sigurd while he sleeps. And much like the story of Rostam, at the very end, as he's dying, he was able to get a hold of his sword Gram, which is just sitting there, and he throws it across the room, cutting the fleeing Guttorm in half and exacting his vengeance. But unfortunately, it's too late. Sigurd is going to die, and there is a mass funeral, because not only, by the way, is Sigurd killed, Brunhild makes sure that Sigurd's son by Gudrun, a boy by the name of Sigmund, named after his father, is also killed. And then Brunhild commits suicide. So this is really is a group funeral. And so here's an illustration of the laying out of the body of Sigurd along with his son Sigmund and Brunhild herself, what are going to be burned in the Viking funeral. Okay, so that's the tragic end of Sigurd, but it's not the end of the Volsunga Saga. Your textbook gives you a little bit of an idea of what unfolds afterward, but it's dragged out a little bit more in the actual text. So what happens to Gudrun and Gunnar and the rest of the Gjükingar? Well, Gudrun marries again. She marries a guy by the name of Atli, who is the brother of Brunhild, and this is, again, Attila the Hun. Gudrun doesn't want to marry this guy. He's not the best character in the world, and Atli ambitiously would like to get his hands on that wonderful gold hoard that he knows the family possesses. And as a matter of fact, it's in the possession of Gunnar and his brother Hogni at this time. They're the only ones who know where the gold is. And he, again, is going to lay a trap for the brothers and invite them out to, his palace. Gudrun tries to warn the brothers, and there's actually a scene in the story where the brothers' wives are... they have premonitions that their husbands are about to walk into a trap, All right, so this is Gunnar and Hogni's wife warn him, and this is kind of standard that we find in other literature. For instance, if you're familiar with the story of the assassination of Julius Caesar, the ancient Roman historians mentioned that Julius Caesar's wife warns him. She has a dream that kind of warns her that her husband is going to be, ambushed. She tells her husband, not to go to this meeting at the Senate House, but Julius Caesar apparently doesn't listen to her, and he goes anyways, and he's stabbed to death. Okay. Historical episode with probably a little bit of, folklore element kind of woven into it. And the same thing happens in this story. The wives tell their husbands, don't go, it's a trap. But Gunnar and Hogni don't listen. They go out and, of course, are captured. Other men are killed, and Hogni and Gunnar are interrogated separately as to where the gold is by Atli and his men. Now, what happens is Gunnar makes a deal with Atli and says, if you bring me the heart of my brother Hogni, then and only then will I tell you where the gold is hidden. Now, Atli doesn't do this initially. He actually brings him somebody else's heart to try to, trick Gunnar, but Gunnar doesn't fall for it because the heart that he's brought is kind of a cowardly heart, which he can tell because it's trembling in his hands. And he says, my brother, who's, much braver man than this, would never have a heart that trembles. Go out and actually bring me my brother's heart, and then I'll tell you where the gold is. So Hogni meets his death at the hands of Atli. His heart is brought to his brother Gunnar. But the reason Gunnar is asking for the heart is just to make sure that nobody else is able to tell Atli where the gold is. So as soon as he has the heart, he realizes he's the only one left alive who knows the location of the gold, and he refuses to talk. At which point he is placed in a snake pit to be tortured and potentially killed until he gives up the secret. Now, he is not going to give up the secret. As a matter of fact, his sister Gudrun passes him a harp, which he plays. His hands are bound, so the story is that he plays it with his feet, which you can see in this little wood carving, Gunnar in the snake pit. And this harp, again, is able to put to sleep the serpents. Unfortunately, it doesn't put them all to sleep, so there's one serpent that's able to actually bite him, and it burrows its head into his chest, and Gunnar dies. So, much like the true Burgundian kingdom comes to a demise at the hands of the Huns, here you've got the last Burgundian king, Gunnar, who comes to his death at the hand of Attila in the story. But that's not it. It's not it for Gudrun. She's lost her brother. She lost her family. She's married to a man she doesn't love. She's had a number of children with him, but she's going to exact the most gruesome revenge on Atli as she decides to carve up their own children and feed them to their father. Okay? A Thyestian Banquet. If you don't know the name Thyestes, this is another mythological character from Greek mythology who was served his own children by his brother Atreus. This is actually tied into the story of Agamemnon and the Trojan War. This is ultimately the father of Agamemnon, Atreus, who carves up his brother Thyestes' children and serves them to him. But to make it, fully tragic, not only, the eating of your own children is pretty bad, but she finishes him off with what we might call a Targaryen barbecue, because she decides then to burn the entire palace down around Atli and his men. And they all die, kind of like a good, mad Targaryen king, just burn them all. And that's the end of Atli and his household. All right, Gudrun has exacted her vengeance. But again, the story's not over. So bear with me a little bit longer as we check out the death of the remaining Volsungs. The last wedding that we come to in the story is really the wedding of Gudrun and Sigurd's daughter, Svanhild. Now, Svanhild was sent to marry King Jormunrek. And the story is that Jormunrek had a younger son who would have been more appropriate for somebody the age of Svanhild, because she was a young and beautiful woman. Now, Jormunrek finds out that the son is going to, has this relationship with Svanhild and decides rather to kill her. So he has her torn apart or trampled by horses, and she meets a tragic end. So that's the daughter of Sigurd is now dead. They do have a final vengeance. Gudrun sends her other sons to exact vengeance on King Jormunrek, and these are Hamdir and Sorli, who literally disarmed the king by chopping off his hands. But before the king dies, he's able to kill them, so that's the end of that family. What about the daughter that we mentioned way back when, Aslaug? Well, Aslaug is only mentioned briefly in the Volsunga Saga. This is the daughter of Sigurd by Brunhild. Now, she will show up in another saga that you may have heard of. It's the saga of Ragnar Lodbrok. This is a story that's really done pretty well in the I was going to say HBO series. It's not HBO. It's History Channel. History Channel did a series known as The Vikings. If you haven't seen it, it does feature the character of Ragnar Lodbrok, who is a famous, legendary Viking warrior, but also this Aslog, who's one of his brides, and she's the daughter of the great hero Sigurd. So you do have some interesting stories about her being kind of smuggled out by her uncle Hamdir. And in a harp, she eventually is found, and this old couple ends up killing the uncle, and they think he's got gold or something hidden in his harp, and they open it up. They find out there's this young child who is then raised by these foster parents, these poor foster parents, again, kind of fitting into that whole idea of the family romance that we looked at with Otto Rank last time when we did Thor. So I'm just going to leave it at that. We're not going to cover the story of Aslog. But let's take a look now at some other versions of the story. Because like I said, your textbook weaves together various traditions. Now, one of the places we get elements of the story is in the Prose Edda. The Prose Edda was by Snorri Sturluson and was written from a Christian point of view. As a matter of fact, a lot of people think that the story itself, especially the dialogue with the gods, called the Gylfaginning, or the Deluding of Gylfi, that particular section, which we did not cover, it talks about the origins of the universe and all that kind of stuff, is really a competition between Christian worldview and the Norse pagan worldview. We could look at it as kind of representing the end of the pagan era for the Norse people, maybe the twilight of the gods, which is where the word Ragnarok actually comes from, twilight of the gods, kind of the end of the divinity. So you got to understand that Snorri's writing this text with a Christian worldview in mind. When he's writing it, the Norse have essentially been converted by this point to Christianity, and paganism is definitely on the decline and starting to disappear. Now, what he does in the context is not only introduce kind of Christianity into the picture, but he also goes back and draws from the Greco-Roman mythological tradition. And this is a technique that we might refer to as euhemerism. If you don't know that term, it goes back to the ancient Greek Euhemerus, who had the theory that all mythology is, all the stories of the gods are based on older stories of actual kings, actual human heroes, and over time these stories are embellished and these one-time heroes become gods. Okay, so it's an explanation of where the pantheon comes from and where the mythology comes from. So when we talk about euhemerism, this is exactly what Sturluson actually does in the story. So for instance, when he talks about Odin and Thor, he actually talks about these characters as being derived from ancient Greece. He says Thor was originally a man by the name of Tror, and he was a grandson of King Priam from the city of Troy. So again, the name is tied in. And this grandson ends up leaving Troy and going into Thrace and eventually up into, Scandinavia or the Germanic territories, where generations later, literally 18 generations from Tror, you get to Woden, who is going to be the origin of the character of Odin. So it's kind of reversed. Instead of Thor being a son of Odin, Odin is a descendant of Thor, according to Sturluson. But in this text, he also mentions Siggi, who is the son of Odin, the third son of Odin. And that's where we end up getting to the story of the Volsungs. It's tied in the story. Now, the differences between what we get in the Prose Edda and the Volsunga Saga are some of these. And I'm only going to give you a handful of differences with some of these upcoming works. So, for instance, very clearly, Brunhilda, called Hild, is introduced right off the bat as a Valkyrie. So it's very clear that she's a Valkyrie. It's a little bit ambiguous in the beginning of the Volsung Saga. They do not promise to marry each other in the Prose Edda. Sigurd does marry Brunhild as Gunnar. Okay, so when Gunnar marries Brunhild, it's actually Sigurd that goes to the ceremony in place of Gunnar. He gives her the ring on Varanot, but he gives her that in exchange for her own ring. So when we come to the scene, where the revelation is, it's not the cursed ring that is brought out as proof. It's the other ring. Anyways, Gunnar and Hogni ends up hiding the gold and burying it in the Rhine, and that's where it disappears. So it's very similar, but it's not as complete, and you do have some changes. More significant changes are going to come in some of these subsequent works. The Poetic Edda definitely has some differences and some contradictions. So, for instance, the first one might be one of the most obvious. Sigurd doesn't wake Brunhild. He wakes a different Valkyrie by the name of Sigurdrifa. Now, the question is Sigurdrifa the same as Brunhild? It appears that she is, but they're giving clearly a different name in this oral tradition. Gutorum kills Sigurd in the forest. This is more like the version in your textbook. Guttorm also kills Sigurd in the bed. So you actually have both of these accounts woven into the Poetic. So again, contradictions abound. And again, these are just fragments of the tale. And then we do get an introduction to Brunhild after her death as she journeys into hell, journey to hell. And in this account, she actually does reveal some of her earlier story, which lines up very much with the Sigurd Rifa material. So it's clearly the case that Brunhilde and Sigurd Rifa are the same character, but probably different traditions have been woven together in the Poetic Edda. The Nibelungenlied, the biggest and most famous of all the versions of the story, has a bunch of differences. I'm going to highlight a few of them. This is much longer than the Volsunga Saga, but the character is not Sigurd, it's Siegfried. And Siegfried is raised by his father Sigmund and Siglinde. The Horde, the Gold Horde, actually comes from where the title comes from, two brothers, Nibelung and Schilbung. Okay, so they own the gold, and this is the gold that Siegfried is going to come upon and take. The sword that he wields is not Gram, but the sword is named Balmung. He also has a cloak of invisibility in the story, so he's able to actually disguise himself by wearing what's called the Tarnkap. So he can turn invisible, kind of like Harry Potter. He does kill the dragon, Fafnir, and then bathes in its blood, taking on the power of invulnerability with the exception of that leaf-shaped impression on his back. So that is directly from the Nibelungenlied into your textbook. Then you have the idea of winning for himself the hand of Kriemhild. He doesn't marry Gudrun. He marries Kriemhild, which is very close to Grimhild, the mother's name in the Volsunga Saga. But he's going to win her hand by helping her brother Gunther win for himself the woman Brunhild, who is the queen of Iceland. Now, Brunhild is a powerful woman, and she has vowed never to marry anybody unless they can complete 3 challenges. So Gunther undertakes the 3 challenges to win the hand of the queen, but it's Siegfried who is going to win the challenges for him using his invisibility. Right? He puts on the Tarnkap and then it completes the 3 challenges. And in gratitude, Gunther gives him his sister Kriemhild, who he marries. Now, when Gunther is married to Brunhild, he needs to sleep with her to consummate the wedding, but Brunhild, being more powerful than Gunther, refuses to let her touch him, and she fights him off over and over again. In which case, Gunther decides he needs Sigurd's help to sleep with his wife, and Sigurd helps Gunther by putting on, again, the invisibility cloak and basically subduing Brunhild so that Gunther can consummate the marriage. It's a kind of a depressing, forced consummation, a rape scene for the most part. And after he sleeps with her, Brunhild loses her power along with her virginity. That's kind of the deal. But this is why she was kind of resisting Gunther's advances. In gratitude, Siegfried is then presented with Brunhild's ring and her belt as a reward. Now, this ring will then be given to Gunther's wife, Kriemhild, and later you find out that you have this revelation scene as well between Kriemhild and Brunhild as they're going into a church. They actually have a conversation about the loss of Brunhild's virginity, and Kriemhild's under the impression that it's actually Siegfried that took her virginity. And this is, kind of backed up by the ring because she knows she gave the ring to the man who she slept with, and of course Gunther then gave it to Siegfried. So there's again a mixed up identity issue, but ultimately it's going to result in the killing of Siegfried by this time Hagen, not Guttorm, but Hagen ends up killing him on a hunt through the weak spot, and very much again like your text. So that's where some of those elements in your text come from. That's not the only version. The one last version I'm going to bring up is the version that's known as Thidrex Saga, and it has elements from both of those tales. Thidrek is based on another historical figure, a guy by the name of Theodoric the Great, or Theodoric the Ostrogoth. Again, kind of late Roman Empire period, and in this story you've got the character of Sigurd, the son of Sigmund and Sisibe, who are sent into exile, but when the child is born, he is adopted and found by a character known as Mimir. So again, it's a baby in exile type of a scenario, as we commonly find in mythology. But Mimir is not a good, foster parent. Mimir actually gets tired of the child as he starts to grow and wants to get rid of the child, so he sends him out to kill a dragon. So Mimir kind of replaces Regin, but then Regin replaces Fafnir because the serpent's name in this story happens to be Regin. Regin's the dragon. And again, to try to get rid of Sigurd, but it doesn't succeed. Sigurd ends up killing the dragon. Regin, bathed in its blood, becomes invulnerable. Later obtains the horse Grane from Brunhild, so you've got that whole scenario. And then you've got the encounter with Thidrek himself. where he has to fight Sigurd. Sigurd, again, having invulnerability, is very difficult to fight. For 3 days, these two fight each other, and eventually Thidrex gets a magic sword named Mimung, which he uses to defeat Sigurd. Doesn't kill him. This is not the end of Sigurd, but after his defeat, the two become companions, and later in the story, where he's going to meet his tragic end. He does marry Grimhild, again, the mother's name, not Gudrun. Sigurd assumes Gunnar's form in the story to sleep with Brunhild, actually sleeps with Brunhild, consummating Gunnar's marriage, not by helping Gunnar do it, but doing it for Gunnar, removing Brunhild's power, and then at the end, Hogni, the brother, ends up killing him on a hunt. So again, all these versions are very similar. They're very close. You could see slight changes from one to another. No consistent pattern emerges, but that's probably due to the fact that you're dealing with an oral tradition that evolves and evolves and evolves over time. Now, I want to finish up by talking about a little bit of the Christian usage of the symbol of Sigurd and this dragon slaying, and then I want to turn to some of the works of literature that were heavily influenced by this story. The transition when these stories are written down is during the period as Christianity, like I said, is emerging into the Norse world. Paganism is disappearing. That clearly comes across in the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. Now, in the context of this shift to Christianity, like the shift from the Greco-Roman religion to Christianity, you have early Christians adopting pagan ideas and symbols. We talked about how they embraced Heracles as a suffering savior. You're going to see the same thing happen in this era by embracing the image of Sigurd slaying the dragon. We already saw that this image is used in churches. It's used on crosses. Here you've got the Stora Ramsö runestone, which shows a cross clearly right here. But at the top of the illustration, where I'm circling, you see the figure of Sigurd, again, thrusting the sword upward through the dragon Fafnir. Now, why the dragon-slaying motif? Well, it's a symbol that goes back, again, to very ancient mythology, all the way back to Marduk and Tiamat, where we started the semester. But this idea is also an image of Christ. If the Christian community has often viewed a reference in Genesis 3:15 to this prophesied one to come to crush the head of the serpent as a prefiguring of Jesus and Satan. Okay, so Satan is identified with the serpent in the garden and Christ as the one who defeats ultimately Satan. So it's a dragon slayer motif. So clearly what they're going to do is draw upon the figure of Sigurd. It's a little bit more of a close-up, though it's still hard to make out what you're looking at. But again, this is going to have symbolic meaning, so it's very common in Christianity to pull these symbols from elsewhere and then give them a new meaning and interpretation. Some other examples, the Halton Cross, around 1000, around that same period, we're starting to see these images arise for the first time, and again, on a Christian symbol, a cross. This one shows Regin forging the sword, Sigurd sucking his thumb. You see the same scene here in the Halstad Church. This dates to around 1200, and this is where we get a lot of those beautiful wood carvings that I've shown you earlier. And here you can see Sigurd putting his thumb in his mouth as he tastes the blood of the dragon Fafnir right before he gains, wisdom from the speech of the birds. Okay, so Christianity embraces this imagery. But where else do we have an impact? If you didn't already notice, it's the story of Sleeping Beauty. Sleeping Beauty, Brunhild is the original Sleeping Beauty. Most of you have heard of Sleeping Beauty. Many of you have probably even seen the Disney version, which is the most famous modern version that we have. It's one of the most famous fairy tales in existence, and it comes from this tradition, Brunhild. Now, the earliest version of the Sleeping Beauty narrative is actually in the 14th century, 1340, a work called Persephorus, which is the earliest version. And it's a medieval romance. It's actually built off of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Arthurian romance. The Alexander romance is an ancient romance that deals with the story of Alexander the Great. But in this story of Sleeping Beauty, this is not the version you get in Disney. The princess Celandine, if that's pronounced correctly, and the Prince Troilus are the two, right? The Sleeping Beauty and the prince, who's going to hopefully rescue her. Unfortunately, doesn't quite do that. She's put into an enchanted sleep with a piece of flax that's put into her finger. And the weird and disturbing part of the story is the guy Troilus sleeps with her while she's in this enchanted sleep. He impregnates her while she lays sleeping in this coma. And he leaves behind a ring as he departs. Later on, she actually gives birth before waking up. She's still in this coma while she gives birth to her child, and it's the child who ultimately wakes her by removing the flax from her finger. And I guess it has a happy ending when Troilus finally returns to marry her, though I don't really see that story as very child-friendly, to say the least. But again, Sleeping Beauty kind of a household fairy tale. And again, that's what I was pointing out in the beginning, where most people don't know the Volsunga Saga and the stories that I've gone through today. You're definitely familiar with the things that it inspired, and this is just one of them. Let me talk about a couple other inspirations or things that have been inspired by the story. This one, kind of by a combination of the Nibelungenlied more directly, and as well the Volsunga Saga. It's the epic opera known as the Ring Cycle by Richard Wagner. This might not be as well known as Sleeping Beauty, but it's a really important series of operas. It's a 4-part opera that was written by Richard Wagner, 1848 to 1874. Das Rheingold, Das Valkyrie, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung. Okay, those are the 4 parts to it. So I'm not going to go through that. It's a very, very long opera, as you would imagine, if it's in 4 parts. So it's a really complex retelling of the story, focusing on different aspects. So the one that is my favorite, and hopefully the one that you've also heard of, is its influence on Tolkien, right? J.R.R. Tolkien, who we may have mentioned in the past, and we'll definitely mention again when we get to Beowulf, because here's a scholar, an Oxford scholar of literature that not only wrote on Beowulf, but wrote on the story of Sigurd and Gudrun. You can actually find his legend of Sigurd and Gudrun. It's still in print. This is work that he did dealing with the story. And obviously he's influenced by Norse mythology. So I'm going to show you some of the pieces in his Middle-earth material that he drew directly from Norse mythology and from this Volsunga Saga directly. So we are familiar, hopefully, with The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and maybe less so the Silmarillion. Those are the 3 most known works on Middle-earth that he produced. Those are the best. Okay, Lord of the Rings, a lot of people consider his masterpiece. Some fans will argue the Silmarillion is right up there alongside it. Hobbit, written for children, so it's not quite at the same level, but it's still a magnificent piece of literature nonetheless. Middle-earth, right, the setting for the entire story, based on the idea of Midgard. This is exactly what the Norse called Earth, Midgard, or Middle Earth. The dwarves, big role in these stories, also in Norse mythology. As a matter of fact, when you read Snorri Sturluson, the Prose Edda, he goes through and talks about the creation of the dwarves from the maggots and the blood of Ymir. This is during the creation of the world, the story where Odin, Vili, and Ve killed the frost giant Ymir and fashioned the world from his corpse. The maggots produce the dwarves. And then he gives us, Snorri, a list of some of the famous dwarves, including Durin, who is called the second most famous, and then he lists Dvalin, Bifur, Bofur, Bomber, Ori, Nori, Gloin, Fili, Kili, Gandalfur, and Thorin. Names that are familiar to you if you know The Hobbit. I don't know if you've seen the movie. I prefer the book, but all of those names, again, show up in this material. And of course, Gandalfur is the name behind the figure of Gandalf, the most famous of all the magical characters in Tolkien's Middle-earth material. So, clearly taken from Norse mythology, as well as Fafnir. If you know The Hobbit, you know the dragon Smaug, who guards the Gold Horde. This is based, again, on the story of the slaying of Fafnir. Then you have the ring. Can't forget Anvarnot, the cursed ring. The one ring to rule them all. One ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. Famous line talking about the cursed ring in Tolkien, which is a little bit different than the cursed ring in the Volsunga Saga. In the Volsunga Saga, it's a magic power to make more gold. That's not the case in Tolkien. The ring has the power to, bind all the other rings. Remember, there's a series of rings that are produced by Sauron. 3 rings for the elves, 7 for the dwarves, 9 for men, and then the one ring which will control all of them. It ultimately has the power to turn you invisible, right? So it's an invisibility thing, like the cloak that some versions of the story have, given to Siegfried or Sigurd. Now, that story of a magic ring that turns you invisible is actually partially borrowed from Plato. If you're familiar with what's called the Ring of Gyges, story that's found in Plato's Republic, he talks kind of a thought experiment. What would you do if you had the ability to do evil and get away with it without being punished? So there's this idea of the Ring of Gyges, which allows you to do that. You put it on, you turn invisible, you can get away with things. How many people would really choose to be virtuous in that scenario? That's what Plato's kind of wrestling with. But here comes Tolkien, and he borrows both Anvarnot and the Ring of Gyges and kind of merges them together into this horribly cursed ring that we find in Middle-earth. There's another ring in Norse mythology as well, known as Draupnir, which is a ring that is possessed by Odin. It was a gift to him by the dwarves, and it too is magic. It's sometimes characterized as an armband, but still a ring nonetheless, and this one actually produces other rings. Okay, all this idea of many rings from the one ring, kind of tied in with that idea in Tolkien as well. Then you've got the sword, Gram, or Balmung, the broken sword that needs to be reforged. In Tolkien, it's the sword Narsil, which belongs to Elendil and is shattered by Sauron, and then is passed down for centuries until it's reforged for Aragorn as Anduril. Okay, and this is going to be in the Return of the King, the last of the parts of Lord of the Rings. The last thing, and the most important parallel in borrowing from Norse mythology, I think, is Odin himself, who is known as the All-Father, or Alfadur, okay, the creator of the world in Norse mythology. But that word, Alfadur, All-Father, is changed and transformed into a character who shows up in the Silmarillion, Tolkien's creation story, in the form of Ilúvatar, which is basically his version of God. So Ilúvatar, Alfadur, the creator of the world in the Silmarillion. But that's not the only character that is influenced by Odin. If you haven't noticed the description of Odin, again, being the man with the broad-brimmed hat, the one eye, maybe not necessarily the one eye, but again, the broad-brimmed hat, the blue cloak or the gray cloak, a lot of times he's considered gray, the long beard. This is a very familiar depiction if you're familiar with Gandalf again. Okay, Gandalf is very much an Odin-like character who wanders the earth and engages with men just the way Odin does, and has quite a bit of power and definitely has the appearance of Odin. Now, the name is taken from the dwarves, the image is taken from Odin, but this is not the only other Odin character. You've got Ilúvatar, you've got Gandalf, but there's one other character that you may not have thought of that is actually derived from Odin as well, and it's not one of the good guys. It's actually the arch enemy in Lord of the Rings, Sauron himself. And if you haven't caught it, again, the one-eyed god. When you see Sauron, this is the one thing that is the most distinctive. It's the one eye that is always watching and waiting. This is the dark side of Odin. Tolkien kind of takes Odin and separates him into two personalities. You know, Gandalf, Sauron in this combat, kind of a yin and yang Odin version. But again, Tolkien, very important modern writer, really the father of modern fantasy by many accounts. So last thing I'll just throw out right now are some of the themes. I'm just going to throw them up on the screen. Since I've already talked about them in the course of going through the story, and I don't want to go any longer than I already have, some of the big themes that you want to think about as you reread the story, which I would encourage you to do, is the theme of love. The idea of whether love is a virtue or whether love is something that blinds you, and what types of love there are between romantic love for a woman and love of family and friends and loyalty. That becomes a big issue when it comes to Sigurd remaining loyal to Gudrun and the Gukengar, or abandoning them for Brunhild. So it's a big conflict in the story. So heroism is also another important theme. Again, the whole debate over whose husband is better goes back to this Germanic idea of what makes a warrior a good and virtuous individual, and it has to do with courage and skill and all those things that make one a real man, a real hero, and worthy, again, to go to Valhalla. And then the idea of fate. You know, this ring represents a curse that ultimately brings everybody to their destruction. And over again, we can keep coming back to this idea of fate. We talked about Oedipus in the beginning of the semester, the theme of fate in Esfandyar and various other places. How much of our destiny is in our own hands? How much is unavoidable? How much are we just taken along with? So that ring kind of represents that idea of fate, the ultimate demise of every single person that ring touches in the course of the story. It's unmistakable that not everything is in your control. So it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy on multiple levels because we're dealing with many different characters, and all of them, right, if you followed the ring, like I said, come to a tragic end. You know, all the families are wiped out by the end of the story. So it's still a wonderful tale, even though it does have a tragic end. I don't think tragedy ever makes a story less enjoyable. Might not be the type of thing you're going to make into a Disney cartoon again, but it's a wonderful tale. And actually, that's where I'm going to stop right now. What we're going to go on to next time, if I'm remembering correctly, is we're going to turn our attention back to the Greek world, and we should be dealing with the story of Troy. Finally, we'll be dealing with a little bit of Homer, and then on after that, we're going to be continuing with Troy and deal with a little bit of Virgil, some of the two of the greatest ancient poets of all time. So until then, that'll be it.